Hello everybody, welcome to the Fortra webinar, Go Beyond One Size Fits All, looking at data classification. My name is Ian Davis. I am a partner manager here at Fortra, specialising in our data security solutions, including data classification, DLP, digital rights management and secure file transfer. With me on the webinar today, we've got my lovely colleague Piers. I'm going to pass over to him because he'll be able to do a much better introduction than I will.
Thanks, Ian. Yes, I'm Piers Chivis. I'm the product manager for the data classification solutions delivered by Fortra. I've been doing that for a number of years. And product manager means I'm responsible for the features and timelines of releases of the data classification suite. Back to you, Ian.
Thanks, Piers. So welcome everybody and thank you for your time. I appreciate how valuable time is these days. So I'm really grateful for you joining us to spend some time to hear a bit more about classification and how Fortra can assist you in securing your data within your organization. So on the agenda today, we're just going to be explaining and discussing why taking a specialist approach in terms of data classification is essential to your organization. We're going to look at potentially what makes a one-size-fits-all policy potentially not fit for purpose, and how a more granular and more sophisticated approach lends itself better to securing sensitive data or IP. And Piers and I will discuss just a few topics that might give you a little bit of thought on things that you can include when designing a data security policy for your organization. Hopefully you enjoy everything, and if you have any queries, please feel free to reach out to one of your Fortra representatives or one of our partners. And yeah, we'll jump into the session right now. So potentially what is in the session for you? Well, hopefully by the end of the webinar, you will have a clear understanding of why we think a granular approach and a more sophisticated design in your data classification is essential. You'll see that a one-size-fits-all policy where the classification solution is not always going to be sufficient for certain verticals. And also we'll explain some real-life examples of where a granular approach has assisted and helped organizations with the security of their sensitive data in their organization. We'll explain to you what the metadata needs to be flexible and has to work with other solutions within your ecosystem, and why a best-of-breed approach is better to securing your sensitive data. So Piers, I think over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. So yeah, I guess when you're considering your data security, the first question is what do you care about in terms of the content types that you wish to secure? But before I go into those, which some of the examples are on the screen, I just wanted to outline the way I see businesses working around data security. So for example, it's typical that the HR team and only the HR team can see the personal details of the employees. And that's what you'd hope and expect to find. And typically, say, the finance team and maybe the senior executive team are the only people who can see financial results until they're released to the market. Again, that's what you'd expect. If you have a mergers and acquisition department, you likely, not likely, but for statutory reasons and commercial reasons, you shouldn't announce the acquisition until the markets are aware of it. So within any business, there's an internal firewall set up. So doesn't it make sense that your data classification schema reflects those internal firewalls and aids and abets those technical and procedural processes that are already in place to manage those controls? So what sort of data security types do we see that organizations wish to control? PII, of course, is a very typical one. So there's personally identifiable information. legislation like GDPR and CCPA in the US and other privacy laws around the US, and the emerging data protection bill in India are clearly set statutory and legislative requirements on organizations around PII. We also see payment card industry content, so typically credit card numbers, but cardholder data generally, that needs to be controlled. Organizations need to know where it is, they need to discover it, and they need to classify it, and then need to protect it. And finally, there's intellectual property. So typically, very many organizations we work with, say people designing the next semiconductor chip, or the next cola recipe, or the next sportswear shoe. This is your high value intellectual property. And you need to control it. You need to find where it is, discover it. You need to classify it appropriately so it can be controlled. And then you need to protect it with, say, a data loss prevention tool like Digital Guardian from Fortra. And even further, actually, when it comes to intellectual property, you likely need to share that with third parties for the supply chain or organizations you're doing research on for your intellectual property. And in that case, you likely want to control who you can share it with. And you could use a tool like Fortra's Vera, which does digital rights management and secure collaboration. So we typically see those. I don't know, Ian, if you've come across any other typical types of content that need to be controlled by the people you've been working with.
Well, typically as well, I mean, we just mentioned everything to do with your organization's sensitive data, but in this environment, we're working, collaboratively with other organizations, and they're going to have sensitive data that you're working with. A typical example, I always remember one of my first customers was a boatyard in Southampton building hulls for Coast Guard, but they had a contract with the Navy SEALs actually, and they were maintaining their boats, so they had to secure the sensitive data of their customers. It wasn't so much about their PII or their intellectual property; it was securing other people's data. So there's also how we work with other people around the globe and making sure that we're adhering and aligning to what they perceive to be sensitive data as well, I guess.
Yeah, good point. Yeah.
So if we just move on to the next slide. So I was kind of thinking, from data classification is very much a data security tool. A lot of our peers and a lot of other vendors will use data classification to power their solutions, and they use this using the metadata. I mean, every data classification tool applies metadata in a form, right? Yep. However, not all metadata is equal. It's, there is more powerful metadata than others, and that's kind of what I wanted to discuss here, is that everybody kind of knows the typical reason why we apply data classification. It reduces false positives because the metadata drives the downstream technology, etc. However, for me, data classification is a really, really powerful tool at mitigating risk within the organization. So it's not necessarily a security tool or therefore compliance, but generally to mitigate the risk. And a good example of this is, the accidental data breaches that apply when someone accidentally includes a highly sensitive document to an email and sends it to a third party. Could be inside the organization. You mentioned the profit and loss documents. Potentially, if they got emailed to the wrong person, that could be highly damaging for the organization. And without classification in place, that can harm a business. So it mitigates the risk there. But if you have a unsophisticated, sort of non-granular approach to your design and your security policy, and you're just sticking at 3 labels, then on the face of it, you might appear to be reducing risk. You're keeping things simple. But actually, if you've got two departments, if I pick on HR and finance, what makes confidential to HR would not be confidential to finance. They have their own view on these two labels. So, for example, for a finance team, something that's confidential would be the a payroll for employees for that month. It's highly sensitive. It's got PII on it. It's probably going to have some PCI. But at the same time, for HR, they might be having new starter forms. Now, again, this has got PII and PCI, but they are very, very different documents that you wouldn't want either having access to. So from a privacy access management point of view, if you can only apply confidential as a label, how do you prevent each teams from having access to those documents? Now, you can apply a little bit of granularity using some of our peers. So if we go to a second label with a second step, you can give it a confidential with a PII moniker underneath. So now we can kind of see, all right, so this is confidential for payroll. It's got PII payroll information, fine. And that prevents HR from seeing it. But they also use confidential and PII. So again, the only way, if you haven't got a granular approach to designing your metadata, is to add another label. You now have to have confidential for finance and confidential for HR with PII as the second hierarchy. And now you've had to add 2 extra labels to your existing schema. And I've only picked on, a conflict of interest between 2 departments. There's going to be many, many others within any organization. And over time, you're going to build a long, long list of classification options for a company to choose from. And the problem arises there is that as you have labor turnover, you have new people joining the organizations, you have promotions, whatever, mergers and acquisitions. If people aren't trained, and if they don't understand, if there's no help in choosing the right classification, if they're presented with a long, long list, how can you ensure that they're going to select the right classification for that document? Yes, machine learning is powerful and can help you with it, but I still believe there's an element to have that human interaction and to have that sense check to make sure that you're choosing the right thing. If you can provide really powerful metadata and make it really granular, you can add all sorts of context into that label, into that metadata. So you can add things like, data retention periods, who created it, which department, who, how long is it supposed to be held on file for? Should it become public at a certain date in the future, like a profit and loss? We can add so much context that actually that powers the downstream technology, but we can sit it behind just a few labels, and we can guide end users through selecting the right number of the right classification. So instead of having 15 different classification labels to choose from, they can choose from still 3, but then we can guide them through the hierarchy of what context that classification label has. Does that make sense, Piers?
I think right at the end you sort of summarised it really well. It's guiding people through that hierarchy of labels, and I'll touch on this actually in a couple of slides' time. Many vendors just have a long, flat list of labels to support the approach you were talking about, and you can't ask users to pick from a long, flat list. So the hierarchy and the guidance is where you need that specialist help to guide the users. So yeah, and I absolutely agree. Yeah, 100% what you're saying, Ariel.
I also think from having a specialist vendor, you also have the specialist support, right? And that's the other thing, is if it's a one size fits all, the support isn't going to be as focused, isn't going to be as determined in finding the right and helping you fit the classification around your policy. Anyway, let's move on.
Okay, yeah. Just before we do move on, I think it's worth stressing that if the organisation is satisfied with public, internal, confidential buckets, so to speak, and those three or four buckets work for them, then the Fortran data classification solution set will support that as well. But I hope by the end of the webinar, people will see that maybe there's more value in, as you said, in that hierarchy and guided direction towards more sophisticated labels.
Yeah, and actually, you just made me think. You're absolutely right. That maybe within an organisation, you might find that one department are happy with that simplistic approach, but maybe they have another department, like a mergers and acquisitions team, that need a more granular approach. And we can be flexible. We can adjust our schemas so that certain departments see just that simplistic approach. So yeah, it's horses for horses.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll take it from here. It's discussion point 2. I have to say, Ian, if I'm still ranting after 20 minutes, could you just calm me down and move me on to the next slide, please? I'd really appreciate that. So this is a quote from a Gartner report on data classification, and I'll tell you my reaction, but let's read the quote first. So, establish a data classification program. These are Gartner's words. Establish a data classification program by shifting focus from user awareness and training towards automation and the enrichment tools that generate metadata. And Ian just touched on the metadata and setting that, so that last bit makes sense in terms of generating metadata. But I don't want to pick a fight with Gartner, but I think they're completely and totally wrong.
Let's pick a fight.
Okay, and if they're listening, please contact us after the webinar. I'll tell you why I think they're wrong. Not just because we actually, fortunately, have a Terra Nova who do some fantastic security awareness computer aided training courses. I know they're fantastic because we use them ourselves within Fortran. That's not why I'm upset. It's really I think Gartner are touching on, when they say automation and enrichment tools, with machine learning and artificial intelligence. I think that's where they're coming from. And I don't disagree with that approach either. It's not, as you just said, Ian, the machine learning, it has its place. Indeed, at Fortran, in the data classification product set, we have our data detection engine, which is a machine learning capability and can detect personally identifiable information and PHI, or protected health information, as well. And it works really well. It can do better than the human being in terms of identifying PII and PHI. But what upsets me is it's a shifting focus from user awareness and training. It's not, the machine learning is not a substitute for user awareness and training. But I'll give you an example. So Ian, you're building a new hospital, and you need 3,000 people to staff your new hospital. And as an aside, well, not an aside, it's related. A friend of mine just recently had a knee operation, and do you know who did the operation? It was a robot. Quite incredible, really. Quite amazing that can happen now. But a robot literally operated on her knee. So there's a place for automation within your hospital. But these 3,000 people, I imagine you're not just going to get them off the street and not give them any training in medicine, because medicine is complicated. You're not just going to get them off the street and say, shift focus from user awareness and training in medicine in my hospital and get all the robots to do everything. It would be madness, wouldn't it? Why would you think it's different in data security? So I really think that we need to move away from this approach that Gartner are putting forward and have the ability for the users to be trained and aware of the classification or the categorization of the content that they're working with. And I'll give you a good example of this as well, where machine learning falls down slightly. So with machine learning, you need a corpus of data to train the model. You get a whole host of PII, and you provide that to the machine learning technology, and it learns, it's trained, it learns, as the phrase says. But what happens with intellectual property? Intellectual property, by definition, is new. If it's not new, it's not your intellectual property. It has to be new. You can't train an ML or AI engine to recognize intellectual property. The users have to be aware of when they are creating new stuff that could be categorized as IP or intellectual property. So I disagree with Gartner, and we've picked the fight. So hopefully they can come back to us, and we perhaps update people on the webinar of where we get to with that discussion. But yeah, that's where we've on that one, Ian.
On that, I also use the analogy of, you know, the Tesla, right? The Tesla does the self-driving, and I think that's fantastic. It's great. You know, it's an amazing, you know, advancement in our automotive industry. However, I don't think I could ever go on a long journey without trusting the car to do the whole thing, right? I would always be very close to the controls, the steering wheel, the brake, everything, right? And also, if that's the case, if we're going to trust that the car can now drive itself, does that mean that driving tests and driving lessons are also a thing of the past? And I think, you know, I'm open to anyone's opinion here, but I don't think that's the case. I think even with machine learning and AI in our cars, I still think road users will have to have a test. So they, you know, we always need to guide. We always need to make sure our end users are taught and you know, they understand the processes around and the security around their sensitive data. We shouldn't just trust the machine to do everything.
Yeah, I know. I'll just follow up on that point really. With obviously the self-driving cars are trained if a pedestrian walks in front of them to brake, you know, which we'd all expect, and they do that well. So I can see people starting to game the system. So do we need road crossings anymore? You can just walk across the road. And they're all going to brake because they're trained. That's what they do. But people can now just walk across the road without needing no care for their safety or the safety of the drivers, not the people in the car. So yeah, it's an interesting debate, and it's obviously very topical at the moment with various technologies getting a lot of highlights. But I do really want to stress that user awareness, as you said, and training has to happen to have a secure organization. All right, so move on to the next discussion point, which is still with me. This is sort of ironic, actually. This, as it says, where I want to talk about two scenarios where classification isn't used. And bear in mind, I am the product manager for the data classification tools within Fortran. So that seems like an odd scenario. But yeah, the first one I want to talk about is the CUI, which is controlled unclassified information, which is a data classification schema produced by the US government by NARA, the National Archives and Records Administration. And now many people on the webinar maybe everyone on the webinar may say, I'm not involved with the US government. That's not, you know, why would I be interested in this? But bear with me. So what NARA have done, they have produced what they call categories of information. They categorize the information that might be used and generated and consumed by US government departments, agencies, and suppliers. And some examples of categories like privacy. They also have finance and patents as well. As example, three of the top level ones. They have about 20 top level categories, but within those categories, and this is to your point about hierarchy, Ian, they have subcategories. So patents has inventions. You can categorize it as patents, inventions. Finance has budget. You can categorize it as finance, budget. HR has privacy, or rather privacy has general privacy. And these all sound a bit governmental and a bit complicated, but actually patents, inventions is just IP. Privacy, general privacy, and it says in the NARA documentation, this is PII. And finance budget is just your sensitive financial details. So NARA, although they have about 120 categories and subcategories, far too many for most organizations. It's far too complicated, but it clearly covers the entire breadth of the US government needs, so that's why it's so large. But the approach, I think, is absolutely key. They're not actually using those public, internal, confidential buckets. They're categorizing the type of information. And then they can drive third-party or downstream security tools like data loss prevention and digital rights management and secure email gateways with the metadata that's set against, say, privacy, general privacy, or patents inventions. In their case, they may wish, when it's patent inventions, to secure it with a digital rights management solution, so that those inventions are not getting out of the business or the government inappropriately. So yeah, I think that talks to the hierarchy that you talked about, Ian, previously. So that's I think a great approach. And I would, even if you're not involved with the US government, I would encourage people to Google NARA CUI and look at their approach. It's a bit of a dry read, won't keep you up at night, but it's certainly, if you're involved with data classification schema within your business, it's a good approach, I think. And so the second example then is if you consider me on the side of a hill in a field hospital put up by the UK MOD, UK Army, windswept, of course. And this is in the UK. I was at a conference, a defence conference, where the UK MOD were there, US DOD, and Australia, Canada, and New Zealand representatives as well. And I said to a UK service personnel, when you're in theatre, how do you classify your information? And he said, we don't do classification. And you can imagine my jaw dropped, because I was at that conference to try and basically sell classification software to the defense organizations. And he said, well, we're on a secret network. Everyone's cleared the secret. Why would we bother classifying stuff? Which made sense. I got that. But I pushed him a little bit more and said, well, what if you want to send information from the UK to, say, the US? I said, we have releasable 2 for that purpose. Releasable 2 US, releasable 2 Oz, or Australia. And indeed, releasable 2, if you're not familiar, is the means to allow organization to get off one nation's network to another nation's network effectively. So you can have releasable to Oz, releasable to US, or releasable to Oz and US, so it can go to both their networks. So they weren't actually really doing classification. They were classifying things as secret, but that was fairly academic, because that wasn't the control that was being used here. So how does that fit within your organization? So again, I'll come back to intellectual property and say that you likely need to share your intellectual property and other sensitive content types with third parties, in which case it's releasable to your supply partner 1, for example, but not releasable to supply partner 2, because for this particular project, supply partner 2 might be working with your competitor. So it's really a great way. I wouldn't use the phrase releasable to necessarily, but the principle of it is it's a way and means of controlling where your sensitive data can go to. And again, I'll go back to digital rights management. Our Vera technology provides if you're releasing to supply partner 1, then you only want supply partner 1 to have that information, and you don't want them passing it on to their third parties or their supply chain. So you can control that with Vera, driven from the selection of the data classification in the data classification software. So yeah, I think that's just 2 ways. It's a more specialist approach. It's getting away from that public, internal, confidential bucket sort of approach, which is, as you said earlier, Ian, is very, or not granular at all, very, very restrictive in the means of setting control over the content types that you care about. So yeah, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, Ian, or you want to move to the next slide.
No, I think you said it perfectly. I think we're looking at time as well. So if we go to the next slide. So kind of in conclusion, I mean, we've discussed that, a lot of the problem I have is that a lot of the one size fits all solutions are packaged to have a lot of essential tools within them, and offer, something that is good enough, right? It ticks a box, but unfortunately, that's when it comes to things like security. Is good enough. So, like you mentioned, the hospital, you don't want just good enough, right? You need something specialist for security. So this is why you really need to, actually, sometimes we said it, sometimes that good enough might be fine. But if you're working in certain verticals or certain departments, certain industries where there's a high level of compliance and regulation, or maybe you've got sensitive IP, research and development, have you got CAD drawings that are, they are the secrets, or they're the secret source, the crown jewels of your organization. You're going to need something more specialist to protect that sensitive data. Compliance, like I said, mostly does dictate a level of classification, but GDPR doesn't dictate that you have to have classification. It says you have to have control over your data. And I think having classification is a good proof that you do have a good level of control. So, for example, if someone requests a subject access request, having classification in your organization will help find that the sensitive data within the time frame given to you by GDPR. However, there's a starting point, right? And actually, if you're looking at, say, a zero trust approach, which I know a lot of organizations are looking at how they can adopt a zero trust approach within their environment. It's a huge journey to go down, and a massive undertaking. But it does all start with understanding where your data is and what it is, and providing that granular, that sophisticated design to the context of what the data is, so that when you do come to authenticate and validate, you can ensure that the person who's requesting to have access should have access to it. Because if it's just got one level of classification, that isn't going to be enough to make sure that you're giving access to the right person. And kind of in, we've been doing data security, I think almost combined it 40 years now, roughly. This is something that is in our DNA. It's not something we're just getting used to. We are a safe pair of hands. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us via the website, speak to your Fortra representative, or engage with one of our partners, and we'll be happy to talk you through anything we've discussed on this, in this webinar. I just I'm going to sort of touch on this. We've discussed a lot of other solutions around data classification and how it empowers downstream technology. So Piers has mentioned Vera, for example. The data lifecycle, or the lifecycle of data, I should say, is circular, and there's no start, there's no finish. But at Fortra, we have got solutions to cover the entire life cycle of data. So if you are starting this journey and you do have a project around securing your sensitive data, we're a great place to come to help you with and guide you and give you consultancy on where to start and how to secure and what to look at, especially when building your policy and designing that policy to fit your company, so that you're not buying a one-size-fits-all and trying to adopt it to fit your policy. It's not the right way to do things. Piers, have you got any comments on this?
Yeah, well, I was just looking at number one there, discovery. It's surprising how often organizations literally don't know where their sensitive data is. It seems odd to say, but yeah, very many are slightly embarrassed, but they shouldn't be, because it's a common scenario that they just simply don't know where their sensitive data is. So we have solutions to help with that. And as you said, start you off on the journey of finding out where your sensitive data is, and then, as it says, categorizing and classifying subsequently. So I think it's a great image to sort of take people through the life cycle. And as you say, You were very polite there when you said 40 years experience. We've been around the block, so we know what we're doing.
Perfect. Okay, thank you very much for joining us today. I hope you found it useful. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's been thought-provoking. Like you said, Piers and I are open to discussions with anything that we've talked about today. So if you want to engage with us, please reach out to your Fortran representative, and we'll be happy to set up a call to introduce you to some of the other solutions that engage and collaborate and cooperate with data classification. So I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to hearing from you soon. Cheers for the time, Piers.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.